1861. Infantry tactics had hit a dead end. On the battlefields of the mid-19th century, soldiers carried muzzle-loading rifles. The process was slow. A soldier had to stand, ram a lead ball down the barrel, and aim. Even an expert could only manage 2 or 3 shots every 60 seconds. The results were catastrophic. The American Civil War produced casualty lists that horrified the world. Commanders watched thousands of men die in single afternoons. They needed a solution. They needed a way to increase the volume of fire without increasing the number of bodies on the front line. The goal was simple: more bullets in the air. Dr. Richard Jordan Gatling watched these events unfold. He was an inventor, not a soldier. He observed a specific statistic: disease killed more men than combat. Crowded military camps were death traps. Gatling reached a radical conclusion. He believed that if one man could fire as fast as 100, armies could shrink. Smaller armies meant fewer men in camps and fewer deaths from infection. It was a strange humanitarian logic. Gatling convinced himself that a more lethal weapon would shorten wars and save lives. He went to work. The result was a machine that changed the nature of combat forever. The design was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. Gatling utilized a cluster of barrels arranged around a central axis. Early models featured 6 barrels. Later versions used 10. The operator did not pull a trigger for every shot. Instead, he turned a hand crank. The footage of the mechanism shows constant motion. As the handle turns, the barrels rotate. Each barrel performs a specific task at a specific position in the circle. One barrel loads, the next fires, the third ejects the spent casing. This cycle repeated as long as the crank turned. The ammunition sat in a hopper or a gravity-fed magazine on top of the gun. Gravity did the work. As each breech opened, a heavy cartridge dropped into place. There were no gas systems or springs. It was pure clockwork. The sound was a rhythmic clatter. It wasn't the bang of a single rifle, but a continuous stream of fire. The Gatling gun could discharge 200 rounds per minute. In an era of single-shot muskets, this was an impossible speed. But this was only the beginning. The weapon was heavy. It sat on a wooden carriage with large wheels. It looked like a small cannon, but it functioned like a factory line. The soldiers didn't have to think. They only had to turn the handle. There was no turning back. The age of the machine gun had arrived. 4 o'clock. This was the exact position where the cam-driven mechanism slammed the round into the chamber and fired. The metal clicked. The barrel continued its downward rotation. A heavy brass casing was ripped from the breech and dropped out of the bottom of the weapon. How did one man outperform an entire platoon? The answer was automation. By distributing the heat and mechanical stress across 6 rotating barrels, Richard Gatling bypassed the limits of human speed. Early models achieved 150 rounds per minute. Gravity was the only real speed limit, as the hand-cranked hopper struggled to feed rounds fast enough. Gatling did not stop. He redesigned the feed system and hardened the internal cams. By the 1880s, the weapon evolved. Using new all-metal cartridges, the fire rate climbed to 400 rounds per minute. The sound changed from rhythmic clicks to a continuous mechanical roar. Gatling even experimented with an electric motor. It pushed the rate of fire beyond 1,200 rounds per minute. The footage of early tests is clear. The weapon was too fast for its own time. Battery technology was heavy and prone to failure. The experimental motor was scrapped. Despite this massive firepower, the Gatling gun sat on the sidelines of the American Civil War. General Benjamin Butler was an exception. He saw the potential and reached into his own pocket. He purchased 12 guns with his personal funds and deployed them in the field. But he was alone. The official Ordnance Department refused to listen. They viewed the weapon as a liability. The logic was simple. Rapid fire wasted lead. High-ranking officers believed soldiers would spray bullets into the trees and drain supply lines in minutes. They preferred the disciplined, slow fire of traditional muzzleloaders. Gatling later called the chief of ordnance an old fogey who still dreamed of flintlocks. Conservatism won. This bureaucratic wall, combined with minor technical glitches, kept the Gatling gun out of the hands of the infantry. The weapon that could have ended the war early remained in warehouses. The United States Army did not officially adopt the Gatling gun until 1866. The war was already over. 1866. The Gatling gun entered the global market. Armies around the world began placing orders. It became the primary weapon for colonial campaigns. The British military shipped the heavy crates to Africa during the Anglo-Zulu War. They faced warriors armed with traditional spears and shields. The result was a slaughter. 2 Gatling guns could stop a frontal charge of thousands. The barrels rotated, and the lead mowed down everyone in the path. This was the first time history witnessed the true power of a machine gun. It turned the battlefield into a factory line of death. But the design was not perfect. It required a hand crank and a massive carriage. 1883, a new inventor appeared. Hiram Maxim introduced a fully automatic, single-barrel weapon. This gun did not need a person to turn a handle. It used the recoil from a fired cartridge to eject the shell and chamber the next round. The machine was doing the work itself. The Maxim gun was a breakthrough, as it was lighter and required a smaller crew. Within a few years, new gas-operated models outperformed the Gatling in every category. The bulky multi-barrel design started to look like a relic of the past. Then came the 1890s. Smokeless powder changed everything. Old black powder Gatlings produced massive white clouds of smoke. These clouds gave away the gunner's position immediately. The new Maxim guns used smokeless powder and stayed hidden. They were water-cooled and belt-fed. They were more efficient, more portable, and more lethal. The transition was final. Militaries stopped buying the heavy hand-cranked machines. 1911. The United States Army officially declared the Gatling gun obsolete. The weapons were moved to storage or melted down for scrap metal. The era of the rotating barrel seemed to be over. No one predicted a comeback. But a new problem was emerging. It would take another world war and the invention of the jet engine to bring the design back. The pace of combat was about to accelerate beyond human reaction times. The footage from the era shows the change. Slow carriage-mounted guns were replaced by sleek, tripod-mounted automatics. The sound of the battlefield changed from a rhythmic clanking to a continuous roar. The Gatling concept was dead. At least for a few decades, events accelerated. Jet aircraft began to fill the skies. These planes moved too fast for standard machine guns to hit. The military needed a weapon with an impossible rate of fire. They needed to reach back into history. The grave was about to open. 1945. The end of the war marked the end of an era in aerial combat. Propeller-driven piston-engine aircraft dominated the skies for years. These machines were fast and carried heavy armor. Their firepower relied on 2 main tools: autocannons fed by magazines and heavy machine guns. Engineers pushed these weapons to their absolute physical limits. The rate of fire from a single barrel could not go any higher. Why did the old system fail? The answer was simple physics. To increase lethality, designers added more guns. They packed wings with rows of steel. But this created a new crisis. More guns meant more weight. More weight required more fuel and larger engines. Space inside the airframe vanished. Development hit a structural wall. Then came the jet age. The introduction of jet fighters made every previous warplane obsolete overnight. Speed changed everything. In a dogfight, an enemy jet would flash through a pilot's gun sights in a fraction of a second. The window to fire was closing. To secure a kill, a pilot needed to saturate that tiny window with a massive volume of lead. The United States Air Force faced a harsh reality. Their standard setup consisted of 650 caliber Browning machine guns. During the Korean War, this was no longer enough. The problem was twofold. First, the rate of fire was too slow for high-speed intercepts. Second, jet aircraft were becoming tougher. Engineers were now protecting key components with advanced armor plating. The Brownings fired 800 rounds per minute. It sounds fast, but in reality, the bullets were too light. They bounced off reinforced fuselages. Even with 6 guns firing at once, the total output failed to tear apart a modern jet. The Air Force tried switching to 20mm autocannons. This provided a heavier punch, but created new mechanical nightmares. The footage from the era shows the failure. The cannons used low-capacity magazines. They jammed constantly under G-force loads. Most importantly, the fire rate remained sluggish. Designers were trapped. A single-barrel weapon could not cycle fast enough without melting or exploding. They could not fit more guns into the nose. The evolution of air combat had stalled, but then everything changed. 1946. The United States military faced a crisis of firepower. Propeller planes were being replaced by jets, and standard machine guns were too slow to hit fast-moving targets. The solution sat in a museum. The Air Force and Army Ordnance launched Project Vulcan. They looked back to the 19th century and the designs of Richard Gatling. His original principle used multiple barrels rotating around a central axis. Engineers planned to modernize this blueprint with high-strength alloys and precision machining. Why did they need an external motor? A pilot cannot use a hand crank during a high-speed dogfight. They replaced the manual handle with an electric or hydraulic power source. This change was critical. The weapon no longer relied on recoil or gas pressure to function. The motor handled the feeding, firing, and extracting of every shell. It was a purely mechanical cycle. Imagine 6 bolt-action rifles mounted in a circle. As the axle turns, a mechanical track cycles each bolt automatically. This design broke the limits of conventional physics. Designers could now push the rate of fire to levels that would melt a standard machine gun. Because there were 6 barrels, the heat and friction were distributed. No single barrel had to bear the full load of the ammunition. Late 1945, engineers Melvin Johnson and Colonel Doc Howe located an antique Gatling gun in a museum. It was a relic of the black powder era. They bolted a modern electric motor to the frame and prepared for a live fire test. The results were immediate. The 60-year-old weapon roared to life, firing bursts at 4,000 to 5,000 rounds per minute. The museum piece did not jam or break. Thick clouds of white smoke filled the range from the old-style gunpowder, but the mechanism held. The test was a total success. It proved that the rotary, externally powered concept was the future of aerial combat. Doubters in the Pentagon fell silent. The era of the modern autocannon had begun. 1946. The United States military faced a crisis. Jet engines made aircraft too fast for traditional machine guns to track. Pilots could only keep an enemy in their sights for a fraction of a second. They needed a weapon that could saturate the air instantly. The solution came through years of trial and error. Engineers looked back to the 19th century and the old Gatling design. The result was the M61 Vulcan. It featured 6 rotating barrels and fired 20mm shells. This rotary cannon would eventually arm almost every American fighter jet for the next 50 years. The development was not easy. Early prototypes suffered from constant jams. Engineers had to redesign the ammunition feed systems from scratch to keep up with the mechanical speed. By 1950, they solved the technical hurdles. The weapon was standardized and began appearing in frontline jets. The final performance was lethal. The Vulcan reached a firing rate of 6,000 rounds per minute. This means the weapon spits out 100 shells every single second. At this speed, the sound is no longer individual shots. It is a continuous mechanical scream. No aircraft of the era could survive this volume of fire. A pilot only needed a split-second window. One short burst filled the sky with a dense stream of explosive metal. This massive increase in hit probability solved the problem that had frustrated the Air Force for a decade. The military soon realized the Vulcan was not just for dogfights. It could shred ground targets, vehicles, and bunkers. But the 20mm system had a flaw. It was too heavy and too large for smaller aircraft. Military planners asked a new question. Could the rotary system be scaled down? They needed a weapon for lighter platforms, specifically for the unprotected transport helicopters heading into the escalating conflict in Southeast Asia. A full-size Vulcan would tear a light helicopter apart with its own recoil. The engineers went back to the drawing board. They kept the 6-barrel rotating design but changed the caliber. They chambered the new weapon for 7.62mm rifle ammunition. This was the birth of the minigun. The name Mini referred only to the size compared to the original Vulcan. The firepower remained devastating. The weapon could fire thousands of rounds of rifle ammunition without overheating the barrels. By 1962, the prototype was ready for the field. The era of the rotary machine gun had returned. 6,000 rounds per minute. This was the rate of fire for the new machine gun. It shared the same mechanics as the heavy cannons mounted on fighter jets. The U.S. Army officially designated the weapon as the M134 minigun. It entered active service between 1963 and 1964. Richard Gatling's original 19th century concept had returned from the grave after 50 years. It was faster and more lethal than the inventor could have ever imagined. The Vulcan and the minigun were about to face their first true test. The setting was heavy combat. Engineers began to push the technology to an absurd level. Consider the math. Take one weapon firing 100 rounds every single second. Then, place 3 of those weapons side by side. 300 bullets per second hit the target. This was the new reality of the battlefield. The United States increased its involvement in Vietnam during the early 1960s. This era introduced airmobile operations. The military relied on the UH-1 Huey helicopter. These machines transported troops across terrain without roads. Traditional Army tactics did not work in the jungle. The Huey was the primary solution. At the start of the conflict, the helicopters were vulnerable. Many carried no weapons at all. Others had only light machine guns. Military planners believed speed and agility were enough to avoid ground fire. They were wrong. The results were catastrophic. The statistics tell the story. Half of all helicopters deployed in Vietnam were destroyed. Mechanical failure played a part, but enemy fire was the primary cause. The Viet Cong used small arms and heavy machine guns to swat the Hueys out of the sky. The footage from the era shows the wreckage. Metal fragments scattered across the rice paddies. The sound of incoming fire was constant. In the frame, pilots are seen scrambling for cover as bullets pierce the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. Something had to change. The helicopters needed more than just speed. They needed overwhelming firepower. Events accelerated. The military decided to mount the M134 minigun directly onto the Huey. This turned a transport vehicle into a flying gunship. A single trigger pull created a wall of lead. It was no longer a fair fight. There was no turning back. Vietnam, 1962. The Huey helicopter was the backbone of the war. But the military soon faced a lethal problem. During insertions, the aircraft had to hover low and slow. This made the Huey a sitting duck. Even a single soldier with an old rifle could bring it down. The thin skin of the helicopter offered no protection. The soldiers did not wait for headquarters. They began to improvise. They bolted machine guns to the side doors. This was the birth of the dedicated door gunner. It was a crude solution to a deadly problem, but the M60 machine gun had limits. It fired 600 rounds per minute. In a jungle ambush, this was not enough. The rate of fire was too slow to suppress a hidden enemy. The solution was radical. Someone decided to multiply the fire rate by 10. They brought in the M134 minigun. The power shift was immediate. The footage shows door gunners discarding the M60. They installed flexible mounts for the new electric Gatling guns. Suddenly, a single gunner could saturate an entire tree line. One man now held the power of a whole infantry platoon, but the evolution did not stop at the doors. Engineers created the gunship variants. They mounted miniguns in side pods and chin turrets. Now, the pilot controlled the trigger. He could aim the entire helicopter at a target and unleash a wall of lead. 1967, the Army standardized the XM-21 armament subsystem. This setup placed a minigun on each side of the Huey. These were paired with rocket launchers. The sound of the minigun was no longer a series of shots. It was a continuous roar. Then came the Cobra. The AH-1G was not a modified transport. It was a dedicated hunter. It was lean, fast, and narrow. The nose turret featured a minigun paired with a 40mm grenade launcher. The gunner used a synchronized sight to track targets. If that wasn't enough, the Cobra carried extra minigun pods on its wings. How did the Viet Cong react? They learned to fear the sound of the rotors. The Huey and Cobra were no longer just flying trucks. They were bristling gunships. The minigun changed the nature of the air war. The era of the sitting duck was over. Moving targets now had the advantage. The jungle floor became a kill zone. This was the new standard of aerial fire support. 1965. The concept of the dedicated attack helicopter became a reality with the birth of the Cobra. It was the first of its kind. But this was only the beginning. Engineers began mounting miniguns on every available surface. They didn't just stop at door mounts. The use of these weapons spread rapidly. As the war progressed, miniguns moved from Huey door pins to the chin turrets of the Cobra. The results were undeniable. The idea of a flying Gatling gun worked so effectively that the United States Air Force changed its strategy. They decided to build entire aircraft for a single purpose: pouring continuous fire onto the enemy. The first was the AC-47 Spooky gunship. This was a retrofitted C-47 transport plane. It carried 3 side-firing miniguns. Starting in late 1964, these planes took to the sky. They flew slow, circular orbits over battlefields under the cover of darkness. The footage shows the process. Pilots dropped flares to illuminate the jungle floor. Once the targets were visible, they unleashed the firepower. Each of the 3 guns fired 6,000 rounds per minute. The pilot controlled the triggers from the cockpit. He could fire them in sequence or all at once. One single AC-47 could saturate an area the size of a football field in under 10 seconds. The sound was a continuous roar. The smell of cordite filled the cabin. When Spooky arrived overhead, the ground became a death trap. Nowhere in that field was safe. United States troops trapped in remote outposts reacted with relief. They cheered when they saw the red tracers in the sky. They called the plane Puff the Magic Dragon. The nickname came from the glowing arcs of tracer fire. It looked like a dragon's breath pouring from the clouds. The gunship would orbit a village or a defensive perimeter for hours. It literally plowed the jungle flat with suppressive fire. Trees were shredded, earth was churned. Records from the era describe the aftermath. There are accounts of AC-47 crews returning to base with empty ammunition crates and scorched barrels. The air war had changed forever. Midnight in the jungle. The Viet Cong soldiers wait in the shadows of the tree line. Then, the air changes. A distant rhythmic drone echoes from the clouds. Seconds later, a solid stream of red light pours from the sky. This was the Red Rain. The enemy had 2 choices: run or die. The VC had no radar and no early warning systems. They only heard the hum of an engine before the red arcs of tracer fire reached the ground. For the guerrillas, this was the most terrifying weapon in the American arsenal. It surpassed heavy napalm and high-altitude carpet bombing. It felt personal. The soldiers claimed the Dragon could hunt them through the canopy. 1,000 rounds per minute. That was the output of a single minigun. The success of the AC-47 Spooky forced an evolution in aerial warfare. The Pentagon wanted more firepower. In 1968, the twin-engine AC-119 Shadow arrived on the front lines. By 1969, the massive 4-engine AC-130 Spectre took to the air. These platforms were flying fortresses. The Spectre was a monster. Technicians mounted 20mm Vulcan cannons and 40mm Bofors guns into the fuselage. Despite the heavy artillery, the small 7.62mm minigun remained the primary tool. It was the staple of close air support. In the dense Vietnamese brush, precision was impossible. Volume was the only solution. The goal was to saturate every square meter of the jungle floor with lead. A pilot from an AC-47 unit recalled a specific night mission. The footage from the cockpit shows the result. When all 3 miniguns fired simultaneously, the tracers converged into a single point. The heat was so intense, it ignited the wet vegetation. The forest floor began to glow. The light was blinding. It illuminated enemy soldiers caught in the open fields. It wasn't just a battle. It was a deadly light show. In many cases, the fighting stopped instantly. Surviving VC units simply melted into the darkness. They abandoned their positions and fled in total silence. The psychological impact of the Spooky was absolute. The Viet Cong High Command issued new warnings to their units. Attacking an outpost protected by a circling AC-47 was a suicide mission. They gave the plane a new name. They called it the Dragon Ship. The era of the gunship had truly begun.